Well, no, I think it's an interesting question because, Liz, who was here from Coca-Cola earlier on, when she heard some of the talks, was saying, well, listen, we've been doing this for 15 years now. These sorts of trials, these plots, these activities, why aren't they commonplace? Why aren't we just doing them? And so the question of that readiness, we know what we need to do to sort of create resilient catchments. We know some of the land-based measures we need to deliver. Why aren't we doing it? And I think really being on things like the flood committees and seeing how things like the funding formula for our public vehicles work, there's still a big gulf between how as a society what our wishes are and how we do things like catchment management are compared to the actual processes we have for distributing funding. They're still very much siloed. They're still very much wanting the same sort of level of accuracy as our engineered solutions, whether that be treatment works or whether that be flood defence features. And I think that's where our problems lie, in just rolling this out and saying, right, let's do this with the 13 billion that the guy was talking around. We're still a long way off of that, and the only thing I can think of is that needs genuine, strong leadership politically, nationally, and over a long period of time, because it doesn't change overnight. If you think too far out of the box in politics, you just seem to be pushed out of the box. So that's my thoughts, though, over the day.
Well, I was to say similar things, but slightly different. In fact, those ideas are already 20 years old, the ideas that we have been discussing. There are a lot of trial and errors and projects, but it's not generally spread. And so one has to reckon that the social system is resilient as well. It's very slowly in adapting things. And I think the 20-year period is normal. So it's my experience. So 25 years or 30 years ago, the environmental movement used to defend ideas in my council, and all the partners thought they were ridiculous ideas. Now we are implementing them. So I reckon that in a normal time, you need 20 years. Only now we are not in normal times, so we'll have to invent things to speed up the evolution, I think.
Speaks to this morning's comment about when you know you've got the finance director asking you questions, you know you've actually hit home. Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a business perspective, as a water company, from a business perspective, as a water company, I think we are still required to provide that evidence base, and I think it's finding that balance between the hard evidence. Lawrence and I were talking in the coffee break about the business cases we need to build versus your gut feeling that it's just the right thing to do, and how we strike that balance and have confidence maybe in testing some of these approaches and being a bit more innovative and kind of willing just to give it a go. Several people have talked today about resilience, and I think business resilience and using that as a hook for engaging other partners and other buyers of ecosystems in the catchment is really key. I think that will kind of build in that long-term view. Particularly around water. As water companies, we're thinking about our business resilience in very long-term trends, but are other buyers of ecosystem services thinking about that? Farmers as businesses, but other businesses as well within the catchment. So how can we look at those other beneficiaries and hook in their finance as well?
Very little. I must say I was pretty amazed that I've learned a lot today, and especially on these reverse auctions and these things. And I think, well, we can learn from things that have been what you've been experimenting with. I think we can learn from that. So I want to thank everybody for that.
That's great.
Well, I must admit I haven't studied the economic regulator very well. It's embodied within that's already one problem. It's embodied within the main water administration as a separate entity, but still it's in that administration. So it's not independent of it. So that's one thing. Secondly, it concentrates on economic operations at the 1 year horizon. So the operations are the sound of the water firms, etc., are they sound from a booking keeping point of view. there's not enough general policy in it, not enough long-term thinking, not enough independency. And so these are things that need to be changed, and they will be changed, I think, during the coming years, because everybody feels that something is wrong in this system.
I think just to kind of pick up on some of those that Jan has made around the periods that we look at in terms of our finance, over 5 years for water companies, is that long enough? I think we obviously have an economic regulator and environmental regulator, and the drivers there don't always align, so we're kind of being pushed and pulled in different directions. So I think that there probably is more work to do, and I think water companies, are really keen to work with others such as environmental NGOs to kind of push some of those agendas and for you to help us influence our regulators. So there would be a plea out there, I think, for us to be working together to look at what are the right approaches and how do we start to sort of break down some of those potential barriers.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think what's interesting in the latest planning period for water companies is we're starting to see a split of the quest for clear financial evidence and information that what we do has an impact, a business impact, and so it's a purely economic cost-benefit assessment compared to a more sort of broader catchment stewardship of understanding that there is a responsibility within the water company to do that. Now, I think both of those vehicles are valid. The difficulty is just how strongly can you build that economic case, and what economic case does Ofwat in that situation want. And I think that the hard thing is it is very complex. This is not rocket science, it's catchment science, and that's much harder. And I think that's where we have the problem.
I think that's our quote of the day, I think. I think the farmer cluster approach is something that we see as a key delivery mechanism, and I think probably lots of other water companies do as well. And certainly that kind of farmer-led approach, so that it's a win-win outcome. You're developing measures with the farmers that work for them and deliver outcomes for us. So I think those farmer clusters, which bring farmers together and do that peer-to-peer learning, peer-to-peer influence as well, I think are really key. And I know, we're certainly helping to fund and facilitate those clusters where the DEFRA funding isn't being applied. So absolutely, I think they're really key.
Just to pick up, I think whatever happens with Brexit, there's sort of the dialogue of how do we support farming and agriculture is a huge opportunity. I think when I look at the change that's happened over the last 15 years, 20 years of understanding that we ought to be looking at our catchments, we ought to be looking at land management, we ought to be asking for more. Even the comments of public money for public goods is a really strong discussion. What's interesting is the amount of social engineering that's happened through common agricultural policy and those payments. We have, in the southwest, we have a lot of farmers that only really survive on their basic payment, and that's a basic payment. We always moan about the payments for doing nothing effectively, and so there are businesses that if we use that payment and say, actually, you've got to do a huge amount with that, that will have a big impact. There are other farms in other parts of the country that aren't like those farms, that are very large, arable farms that are getting huge payments as well. And so I think that the job of trying to understand that complexity is huge. So things like the understanding how that changes, understanding the roles of NELMs, the new sort of environmental land management is huge. And behind all of that is also the government's going to have to actually get the money out of the door. And so for anyone who's worked with or is involved with the RPA, that is in itself a huge hurdle as well. So whilst we talk about these schemes and we talk about N-Trade and we talk about all the different activities, the challenge of actually getting money out the door in a sort of through a government process hasn't been bathed in glory over the years. So it is a significant challenge, and one of the ones where are we ready to do that? As Rivers Trusts, I think we all have mechanisms which we've trialled, and I think there's real potential. But trying to do that in where we're distributing £13 billion, I think that's still quite a challenge.
Jan and Jan, have you anything to add?
Well, I hear things that are familiar. So to distribute money in a way that you get, to distribute your money in a way that you get quality, to monitor the results, to bring the farmers to activities that are viable for them and that leaves them in their dignity, because that's often the discussion. It's all topics that is very relevant also in our in Flanders. So I know it.
Question over there, Nick.
Well, indeed, it's true, but it's a dilemma, because it's the same thing with climate change in general, or with all big societal problems. The message is unpleasant, and many politicians. I once heard a German sociologist, and he said, rather cynically, politics is management of illusions. And in a way, it's true. in a way, it's, suddenly the truth comes out. But in a way, it's true. In a way, people like to live in the illusion that society is well organized, that their activity is part of that well-organized society, so their activity has meaning, and that in the end all will end well. And from the moment that illusion, because it's not that by definition untrue, but it's an illusion that is to think that it's by definition true. So from the moment someone starts to relativize this illusion, then it becomes unpleasant. And there are not many politicians that have the courage to come out with unpleasant messages. It makes me always think about one defining moment in your history, the dichotomy between Chamberlain and Churchill. Chamberlain came back and said, "I have peace for our time." And a year later, Churchill said, "Oh no, there's war. I bring nothing but blood, sweat, and tears." So the one came with an illusion, the other one came with reality. Now, it's also a question of timing. So it's very difficult and tricky thing for politicians to be courageous in this circumstance, but at a certain moment you have to be so.
So just to say on that, I think I completely agree with you. Just at some point in the not too distant future, we may have to make a decision between water for people to drink and water for the environment. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't have any vision of what way that decision will go.
Well, nowadays in Flanders, it is gradually becoming a public discussion in which we are categorizing ways of usage of water, inclusively nature function, and how to deal with it when there is tension. And so it gradually is becoming part of the discussion. And that's one way of dealing with it, to bring unpleasant subjects gradually into the public attention and remaining calm.
At least water shortages are very visible in the public. I mean, yeah, it doesn't work anyway. So.
Can you move? Oh, there we go.
That's an illusion.
If people are confronted with rivers running dry, if they cannot go kayaking on the streams, if they cannot go fishing, if they see the fish lying dead, I think it will at least start up a conversation much more quickly than it is with the climate change.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're exactly right, Nick. I mean, if I look at what's changed since I've been at the Trust, more and more people are now talking about catchment management and these sort of activities when we have emergencies, when we have situations. So it used to be when there was a drought, they'd talk about building more reservoirs. When there was a flood, they'd talk about building more walls. When there was water quality issues, they'd talk about building more treatment works. Now, there is a subtle change in the conversation that I've seen over those years. The trouble is, I think we are at war now. We're not at war with other countries or with Brexit and those sorts of things. We're at war with time. What's happening now is we're seeing these incidents happening more regularly. So you only have to look at the temperature changes to see how that's changing. You only have to look at the incidents. I was talking earlier on with colleagues about the impacts of the freeze last year, the beast from the east. That has significant impacts. The trouble is that we've got this British mentality of stay calm and carry on, and the trouble is it puts us back in the box as soon as we have those pressures. We're going to see those problems of drought, of flooding, of water quality coming more and more regularly, and the question is yes, we've got the systems to think about it, but have we got the balls to do something about it quickly enough? And that's going to be where I'm not sure. And that's where, as I said, we need that leadership and we need it quickly. The trouble is we know that it takes, in the past, it's taken 20 years. But times of national emergency, that Churchill happened very quickly because people went, oh, okay, shit, we do need to do something about it. The question is how quickly will we change?
Hey, can you comment briefly what your customers, how engaged your customers are? Are they interested? Do they know about it? And after that, I'm going to take one final question, then we're going to wrap.
I think it's interesting when you look at the demographic of customers, and different age groups and different demographics have very different drivers and interests. Our customers are interested. They're interested in us protecting the environment, but I still don't think people really value water enough. I think it was raised earlier about how, what people pay for the water coming out of the tap versus what they'll pay for a bottle of water out of a fridge in the shop. We're not allowed to let people turn the tap on and nothing come out, but I think that would really wake people up. If people were to do that and there was no water there, suddenly they would start to wonder where their water came from and why there wasn't enough going round. But I think, we've got that kind of political cushion keeping people away from that. But it's one of our drivers is to do more and more engagement with our customers, and particularly around their willingness to pay. So, in terms of their bills, what their money is spent on, but they are keen to pay for the environment, to protect the environment, and to pay for more sustainable options like catchment management, which is really positive. I think I'm the mother of a 12-year-old boy who took part in the climate change walkout from school. We live in Brighton, so there was there was a lot of kids in Brighton who did that, as you would expect. But I think that was really powerful, and following that on Twitter and seeing how many kids were kind of standing up and saying exactly that thing about you're not doing enough now. I think they are kind of kicking us up the butt to say, you can't keep talking about this, you need to take action, this is impacting on us. And I think they're a really untapped group that we're not listening to enough. So I think it's a really good point.
I think that's a really powerful place to finish. Next generation. Before we do,